Imagine for a second that you are a bishop in the second century.
Okay, setting the scene. I like it.
Right. And you have spent your entire life defending the teachings of Jesus, trying to build this unified Orthodox church. But you have a massive problem.
Really big one, yeah.
Yeah, because the people you consider your greatest theological rivals, this secretive, mystical sect that views the physical world as a literal prison, well, they are rapidly gaining followers.
And the weapon they are using to recruit these followers is not some obscure manifesto they wrote themselves.
Exactly. It's one of your most sacred texts. I mean, they are walking around carrying the Gospel of John, quoting it, writing commentaries on it, and claiming that it secretly proves everything they believe.
Which is just a profound historical irony,
Yeah.
The mainstream Proto-Orthodox Church was actually terrified of the Gospel of John for decades.
Which sounds so crazy to us now.
Right, but they viewed it with this deep suspicion because, honestly, it sounded so drastically different from the other accounts of Jesus' life.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. It is so great to have you listening with us. On the table today, we have this fascinating stack of sources.
We've got ancient historical texts, modern biblical scholarship, translation analyses, comparative timelines, a lot to get through.
Yeah, and our mission today is to embark on this intricate exploration of the Gospel of John. Because, if you grew up in a religious tradition, or honestly, even if you just know the basic cultural story of the New Testament, you probably lump the four Gospels together.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just one big, seamless story.
Right, exactly. Like it's just one continuous narrative. But when you isolate the Gospel of John and analyze it alongside the other three, which scholars call the Synoptic Gospels, a really stark reality emerges.
Yeah, it is a radical outlier. I mean, it actively reshapes the timeline of history, it alters the dialogue of major characters, and it introduces, entirely new theological concepts that just do not exist in Matthew, Mark, or Luke.
It's almost like if the first three Gospels are a documentary series, the Gospel of John is like this avant-garde philosophical indie film based on the same events.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the director is just totally fine with rearranging scenes or changing the dialogue to make a grander point.
Yeah, and to understand why the Gospel of John was written that way, we actually have to start by looking at its reception. We have to go back to that second century identity crisis you mentioned.
The Gnostics.
Exactly. We have to look at the Gnostics.
So let's lay the groundwork for who these people actually were, because, the term Gnostic gets thrown around a lot in pop culture today.
Usually referring to some sort of hidden, esoteric Da Vinci Code conspiracy, right?
Exactly, like secret codes and whatever. But in the second century, they were a very real, very powerful intellectual movement led by figures like Valentinus and Basilides.
And they operated on this fundamental philosophical dualism. Basically, they believed the material world, so the physical universe, our human bodies, the earth itself, was inherently flawed.
If not outright evil.
Right. They believed it was created not by the supreme, perfect God, but by a lesser, ignorant deity that they called the demiurge.
So for a Gnostic, the whole goal of religion was not about, say, a physical resurrection or a physical kingdom on earth.
No, not at all. The goal is to attain a secret mystical knowledge. And the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis.
That's the name.
Exactly. They believed this knowledge would awaken a divine spark that was trapped inside their physical bodies.
And that would allow them to finally escape this material universe and just, ascend back into the pure spiritual realm.
And this right here is exactly why the Gospel of John became their absolute favorite text. I mean, think about how the Synoptic Gospels start.
Right. Matthew and Luke start with genealogies, earthly kings, mangers, shepherds, a physical birth of a baby.
Very grounded. And Mark starts with this gritty scene of a guy in the desert baptizing people in a literal muddy river. All of that is highly physical, earthly.
But John starts in the cosmos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God.
Yes. Right. It immediately jumps into this vocabulary of light descending into darkness, and the darkness failing to comprehend it.
Which, to a Gnostic reader, sounds exactly like a description of that divine spark descending into the evil material world.
Oh, they latched onto it entirely. I mean, the very first systematic commentary ever written on any Christian scripture was written on the Gospel of John.
Wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't written by an Orthodox church father. It was written by a Gnostic leader named Heracleon, right around 170 CE.
I just want to pause on the mechanics of that for a second, because in the ancient world, writing a systematic commentary that was a massive, expensive undertaking.
It was huge. You needed serious resources.
Right. You had to acquire all this expensive papyrus, employ scribes, and painstakingly analyze every line of a text just to prove your philosophical point.
It wasn't just a weekend project.
No. So the fact that a Gnostic heretic was the first person in history to invest that kind of capital and intellectual energy into the Gospel of John, I mean, that tells us how deeply they claimed this book as their own.
Heraclion read the entire Gospel of John as an allegory for Gnostic theology. Like, when Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well, Heraclion argued she actually represented the spiritual soul.
Trapped in the material world. though.
Exactly. Trapped, but being awakened by the divine messenger.
So if you are an Orthodox bishop trying to establish a unified church, one based on the physical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, seeing this highly intellectual, well-funded sect weaponizing the Gospel of John, I mean, that has to induce an absolute panic.
It did. It induced such a panic that a faction within the mainstream church actively tried to destroy the Gospel of John.
Wait, really? Destroy it?
Yeah, they were known as the Elogi, which literally means the anti-logos group, because they completely rejected John's doctrine of the logos or the word.
So they just want it gone.
Totally gone. They claimed the Gospel of John was inaccurate, untrustworthy, and that it was actually secretly authored by a notorious Gnostic heretic named Cerinthus. They lobbied hard to have it completely thrown out of the Christian canon.
That is wild. How does a text survive that kind of crossfire? I mean, if your enemies love it and your own allies want to burn it, how does it end up as the fourth book of the New Testament?
Well, it required a monumental theological defense by a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyons. This was around 180 CE. Irenaeus saw the danger of losing John, but he also saw a way to use it against the Gnostics.
Oh, so?
He argued that the Gospel of John wasn't written to support Gnostic dualism at all. He said it was written to destroy it. And he anchored his entire defense on one single phrase in John 1:14.
Which is?
The Word became flesh.
Because flesh is physical material.
It is physical, sweaty, tangible material. To a Gnostic, the idea that the pure cosmic divine word would become physical flesh, that was utterly repulsive.
It went against everything they believed.
Exactly, and Irenaeus just hammered on this point. He used that one verse to tether the Gospel of John firmly back to the Orthodox belief in a physical incarnation.
You know, this ideological war over the text brings up a massive historical question for me. If you have two rival factions, the Gnostics and the Orthodox, both fiercely claiming the same document in the 2nd century, how do we know they didn't just alter the text to win the argument?
It's a very valid question.
Right, because we aren't talking about PDF files locked on a server. We are talking about hand-copied manuscripts being reproduced in vastly different geographical areas.
And the manuscript evidence reveals that they absolutely did alter the text. Scribes were not always neutral photocopiers, you know. They were human beings embedded in a fierce theological war.
And their fingerprints are on it.
Oh, the surviving papyri are covered in the fingerprints of that conflict. We can see this super clearly in John 1:18.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this variant.
Mm-hmm.
What are the two different versions we have in the historical record?
So one ancient variant of John 1:18 reads, "The only begotten Son who is at the Father's side."
Oh.
But a competing variant reads, "The only begotten God who is at the Father's side."
Oh, wow. Changing Son to God is not just a minor typo.
Not at all.
That fundamentally shifts the hierarchy of the divine beings.
Exactly. Remember, the Gnostics operated on a really complex hierarchy of divine emanations. They believed that the Word, the only begotten, and Jesus were actually separate spiritual entities cascading down from the supreme realm in different layers.
So they weren't the same being.
Right. Textual scholars argue that Orthodox scribes, when copying the manuscript, likely pushed for the word God instead of Son to explicitly crush that Gnostic separation theory.
So by writing the only begotten God, the Orthodox scribe creates this brick wall.
Exactly, a brick wall. They are forcing the text to say that Jesus and the supreme God are the exact same entity, leaving literally no room for those Gnostic hierarchies.
But wait, if a scribe in, say, Alexandria decides to change Son to God to fight the local Gnostics, how does that change propagate?
That's the tricky part of ancient texts.
Right, wouldn't a church in Antioch, which has an older copy saying Son, read the new copy and call it out as a forgery?
Well, the ancient world obviously didn't have a centralized, standardized printing press. Texts were copied locally and shared piecemeal. So a scribe in Alexandria making a change wouldn't instantaneously overwrite the copy in Antioch.
It's not like a cloud update.
Exactly. Instead, you get this branching family tree of manuscripts. The Alexandrian copy is reproduced and spreads through Egypt, while the Antioch copy spreads through Syria.
Which is why modern textual critics have to lay thousands of these fragments side by side.
Yep, to reverse engineer the timeline of these ideological edits.
And the sources highlight another fascinating alteration, this time in John 1.13. This one is about how believers are born, right?
Yeah, this one is really interesting. The plural reading of John 1.13 says, "Who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God."
So that refers to the believers themselves.
Right, and the Gnostics championed this plural reading. It supported their idea that they, the spiritual elite, possessed this divine celestial origin that was completely separate from the ordinary biological reproduction of physical humans.
They read it as a total validation of their own elite status. Like, we were born of God, not of flesh.
Exactly. But the Orthodox scribes altered a single letter to shift the grammar from plural to singular.
Just one letter.
Just one. Western Orthodox copyists pushed for the singular who, quote, "who was born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh."
Oh, I see what that does.
Yep.
By changing it to a singular pronoun, the subject of the sentence changes entirely.
Completely. It is no longer talking about the elite Gnostic believers. It becomes a direct statement about Jesus.
It becomes a defense of the virgin birth.
Precisely. It transforms from a verse about human enlightenment into a verse about divine incarnation, all through the alteration of one single letter.
That is amazing. It's ancient theological maneuvering playing out right in the ink of the manuscripts.
But, this process of translation and adaptation, it didn't start with the second-century copyists. The original author of the Gospel of John was already engaged in this massive, systemic project of translating a cultural worldview.
Right, because we have to remember that the New Testament was written entirely in Greek, but the world it describes, the main characters, the setting, the religious expectations, all of that was fundamentally Hebrew.
And that is a crucial concept to grasp here.
It is, because if you try to translate a deeply culturally specific idea into a foreign language, you can't always just do a word-for-word swap.
No, the meaning just gets lost.
It would be like trying to explain the American dream to an isolated Amazonian tribe. You can't just translate the words American and dream and expect them to get it.
Right, they'd just think of a person sleeping.
Exactly. You have to explain capitalism, upward mobility, home ownership, individualism, all these concepts that might not even exist in their cultural vocabulary.
That's a perfect analogy. The Gospel of John acts as the cultural translator for the Hebrew Messiah. The Jewish expectation of the Messiah was deeply, deeply rooted in physical reality.
Right. The Messiah was supposed to be a prophesied military and political leader.
Yes. Someone who would overthrow the Roman occupation, restore the literal physical borders of Israel, and sit on a literal throne in Jerusalem.
But the author of John is writing to a Greco-Roman audience who doesn't care at all about the political borders of Judea.
They could not care less. They care about philosophy, metaphysics, and the nature of the cosmos.
So the author takes this gritty, physical Hebrew reality and reconstructs it using Greek philosophical architecture. And I think the most famous example of this is the concept of the word.
Absolutely. In the Hebrew tradition, the concept of the word is dabar.
Okay, good job.
And dabar is dynamic. It implies a spoken prophetic word or a divine action. When God speaks in the book of Genesis, "Let there be light," that is dabar. It is an action that shapes reality.
But the author of John does not use a Greek equivalent for a mere spoken command. He uses a loaded, incredibly complex philosophical term, logos.
Yeah, logos is massive. To a Greek thinker, particularly those influenced by Stoicism or the philosopher Heraclitus, the logos was not just a spoken sentence.
What was it to them?
The logos was the abstract, cosmic, rational principle that animated the entire universe. It was the divine reason that kept the cosmos from falling into chaos.
So when the Gospel of John opens with, "In the beginning was the Logos," the author is bypassing those Jewish political expectations entirely.
Completely bypassing them.
He is basically tapping every Greek philosopher on the shoulder and saying, hey, that abstract cosmic operating system of the universe you have all been debating for centuries, it just took on a human body and walked around in Judea.
That is exactly what he's doing. And we see the intricate mechanics of this translation process in the original Greek grammar of John 1.1.
Right, so the English translation we all know reads, "The Word was God."
Yes, but the literal Greek is kai theos onho logos.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that phrase. Why does the Greek phrasing matter so much to how an ancient reader would have actually understood it?
So, in ancient Greek grammar, the word theos, which means God, is used here without the definite article ho, which means the. When the theos lacked that definite article in Greek literature, it often functioned more like an adjective than a proper noun.
Oh, interesting. So it referred to a divine or heavenly being, or possessing divine qualities, rather than pointing specifically to the singular creator God of monotheism.
Exactly, meaning an ancient Greek reader might look at that verse and understand it not as the word was the singular creator, but more like the word was divine in nature.
The Greek phrasing aligned perfectly with Hellenistic ideas of a pantheon then.
Yes, or divine emanations cascading from a higher source. It provided an accessible bridge for Greek readers.
So it wasn't until later, as Christian Orthodox theology codified the doctrine of the Trinity, that this verse was locked in as a strict declaration that Jesus and the Father were the exact same singular God.
Right. But in its original context, the grammar reveals an author carefully selecting terms that would resonate with a Greek metaphysical worldview.
Well, if the author is willing to redefine the Messiah from a physical king into a cosmic spiritual force, that shift must ripple through the rest of the theology. Like you mentioned earlier, that the Jewish expectation was a physical kingdom.
And John spiritualizes that entire concept of the kingdom.
Right, because in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus frequently talks about the coming of the kingdom of God, and it often sounds like an imminent physical reversal of fortunes on earth.
Like the poor will literally inherit the earth. But in John, the kingdom is not physical at all. It is a present spiritual reality accessed through belief.
And the sources point out that this shift in focus impacts how we read some of the most famous verses in the text. I mean, if you grew up seeing John 3.1 cents held up on cardboard signs at football games,
Which happens a lot.
right, you're reading a modern English translation that says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life."
Yep, very standard translation.
But if we go back to the original Greek compilation, the Textus Receptus, there is a different nuance there.
Yeah, we should define what the Textus Receptus is first, just to understand the mechanics of this. In the 16th century, a scholar named Erasmus compiled various Byzantine Greek manuscripts to create a standardized Greek New Testament.
And this compilation became the foundation for early English translations, like the King James Version, right?
Exactly. So when we look at John 3.16 in the Textus Receptus, we find the Greek word atoi, which translates to the same.
Okay, so how does the presence of the same alter the theology of that verse?
Well, a highly literal translation of that construction implies that the belief is directed towards the same God who set the sun. It shifts the focal point.
Ah, I see.
It aligns perfectly with another verse in the Gospel, John 5.24, where Jesus explicitly says, "He who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life."
So the theological center of gravity in the Greek text actually emphasizes believing in the Father who initiated the cosmic rescue mission, rather than viewing the Son as an independent object of worship.
Precisely.
So if the author was willing to translate the very essence of Jewish theology into Greek philosophy, what happens when the actual stubborn timeline of history gets in the way of that philosophy?
That is where things get really controversial.
Because today we have a very rigid expectation of a biography. We expect a chronological sequence: birth, early life, career, death.
Right. Modern readers expect objective chronological journalism. But the Gospel of John belongs to the ancient genre of bios.
And ancient biography wasn't like that.
Not at all. Ancient biography was not about compiling a sterile timeline of facts. The purpose of a bios was to reveal the true essence of the subject, to highlight their virtues, and ultimately to persuade the reader to adopt their worldview.
So the chronological sequence of events was entirely subordinate to the thematic message.
Completely subordinate. And the author of John actually admits this, don't they? They aren't trying to hide their methodology at all.
Yeah, in John 20.31, the author explicitly states their thesis. They say, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God."
The overarching goal is theological persuasion. If rearranging a historical event amplifies the theological truth, the ancient author felt absolutely justified in moving it.
Which brings us to one of the most glaring contradictions in the entire New Testament: the cleansing of the temple.
Oh, this is a huge one.
Yeah. To understand the magnitude of this change, we really have to look at what the temple actually was in first century Judea. because it wasn't just a large church.
No, the Jerusalem temple was the economic, political, and religious epicenter of the Jewish world.
Right. It housed the treasury, it functioned as a central bank, and it was the site of massive industrial-scale animal sacrifice that was required by the Torah.
Just try to picture the smell of blood, the noise of thousands of animals, the money changers converting foreign Roman coins into acceptable temple currency. It was a sprawling, highly lucrative institution.
Controlled by the Sadducees.
Yes, under the watchful eye of the Roman garrison stationed right next door.
So when Jesus walks into that space, makes a whip out of cords, overturns the tables of the money changers, and drives the animals out, he isn't just causing a local disturbance.
Not at all. He is attacking the central bank and the core religious machinery of the nation right in front of the Romans.
And in the Synoptic Gospels, this event happens at the very end of Jesus' ministry.
Yes, it is the inciting incident. It is the literal cause and effect reason the authorities decide he is too dangerous to live. They arrest him days later and execute him.
Which makes perfect narrative and historical sense. You attack the central bank, you get executed.
Exactly.
But what does the Gospel of John do with this event?
Agathana John places the temple cleansing in chapter 2.
Chapter 2.
Yep, at the absolute beginning of his ministry, before he has performed any major teachings or gathered his full following.
Wait, if he attacked the temple in chapter 2, why wouldn't the authorities arrest him immediately? How does he wander around preaching for 3 more years after committing a massive act of public sedition?
Right, it doesn't make historical sense.
Did the author of John just get the timeline confused?
It's not a mistake at all. It is a profound theological statement. John is building an entire framework around the idea that Jesus is replacing the old Jewish systems with himself.
The physical temple is obsolete because the Logos has arrived.
Exactly. By ripping the temple, cleansing out of its historical spot at the end of his life, and pasting it at the very beginning, John creates a massive billboard for the reader.
From day one, the message is, the physical temple system is over. Jesus is the new temple.
The historical when is sacrificed for the theological why.
And this willingness to bend the timeline gets even more intense when we look at the final week of Jesus' life. The discrepancy over the Passover.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like this is a massive contradiction that most people reading the texts in English simply never notice just because they don't understand the ancient calendar.
The timeline of the Last Supper and the crucifixion is arguably the most significant chronological fracture between the Gospels.
Okay, so to understand it, we have to understand the Jewish calendar, specifically the Pharisaic calendar used in the first century.
Right. And the most important thing to know is that the Jewish day did not start at midnight. It began at sundown.
Okay, let's track the days carefully then. What do the Synoptic Gospels say happened?
The Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, state explicitly that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder.
Okay.
This means the meal took place on the evening that begins the 15th of Nisan. Jesus and his disciples eat the sacred meal. He institutes the communion. They go to the garden. He is arrested that night, and he is crucified the following morning.
Which is still legally the 15th of Nisan.
Correct.
So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus eats the Passover lamb and then is crucified the next day. But the Gospel of John gives us a completely different timeline.
A completely different one. The Gospel of John shifts the entire sequence of events back by exactly 24 hours.
So what day is it in John?
In John, Jesus is crucified on the preparation day of the Passover, which is the 14th of Nisan.
Wait, if he is crucified on the 14th, what was the Last Supper they ate the night before?
In John's timeline, the meal the night before was just a regular meal on the 13th of Nisan.
Just a normal dinner.
Right. It was not a Passover Seder because the Passover hasn't happened yet. In fact, John notes during the trial before Pilate that the Jewish leaders refused to enter the Roman headquarters because they don't want to become ritually impure before eating the Passover meal that upcoming evening.
Wow. Wait, if the Synoptics have been circulating for decades saying the Last Supper was the Passover meal, why would the author of John deliberately change the date? What is the theological payoff for causing such a massive historical contradiction?
The theological payoff is just cinematic in its brilliance.
Really?
Yeah. On the 14th of Nisan, the preparation day, the priests in the temple begin slaughtering the Passover lambs to be eaten that night.
Oh, wow.
By shifting the timeline of the crucifixion, the author of John aligns the exact hour of Jesus' death on the cross with the exact hour the priests are slitting the throats of the lambs in the temple.
The cross-cutting is incredible. The author is ensuring that as the blood of the lambs flows over the stone altars in Jerusalem, the blood of Jesus flows down the wood of the cross.
It perfectly fulfills the prophecy made by John the Baptist in the very first chapter of John. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world.
So the Synoptic Gospels tell a story where Jesus eats the Passover lamb, but the Gospel of John changes the timeline so that Jesus is the Passover lamb.
Exactly. A modern reader might look at that and say, well, one of them is lying. They can't both be historically true.
Right.
But an ancient reader steeped in that Bios tradition would view John's altered timeline not as a lie, but as a deeper, more resonant spiritual truth that overrides literal history.
And if John is willing to rearrange the timeline of Jesus' death, I mean, it makes total sense that he also completely reconstructs the supporting characters in the narrative.
We see this reconstruction most vividly with the character of John the Baptist.
Yes, let's look at the Jewish cultural expectation here. The prophet Malachi in the Hebrew Bible stated that the prophet Elijah, who supposedly never died but was taken up in a whirlwind, had to physically return to earth to prepare the way before the Messiah could arrive.
And this was a non-negotiable checklist item for first-century Jews waiting for deliverance.
Right. The Synoptic Gospels address this checklist item directly. In Matthew 11, Jesus is speaking to the crowds about John the Baptist, and he explicitly declares, "If you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come."
It is a definitive, closed case in Matthew. John the Baptist is the fulfillment of the Elijah prophecy, validating Jesus' role as the Messiah.
But the author of the Gospel of John handles this completely differently, don't they?
Oh, completely. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, a delegation of priests and Levites from Jerusalem comes to John the Baptist. They are basically investigating him.
Right.
And they ask him point blank, "Are you Elijah?" And John the Baptist flatly, unequivocally answers, "I am not."
Wait, what? The Jesus of Matthew says he is Elijah. The John the Baptist of the fourth Gospel says, "I am not." That is a head-on collision between the texts.
It is.
Why would the author of John strip away this vital prophetic credential?
Because the author of John is engaged in a systematic theological realignment to protect the absolute supremacy of the Logos.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, in the Synoptics, John the Baptist is a towering, mighty prophet. He is a formidable figure who physically baptizes Jesus and who later, while sitting in prison, actually experiences doubt. He sends his own disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you really the one, or should we expect someone else?"
He's a complex, almost rival figure. But in the Gospel of John, the Baptist never doubts.
No. He is stripped of his prophetic complexity and demoted to a single function.
He is basically demoted to a signpost.
Exactly. The author of the fourth gospel goes to extraordinary lengths to ensure John the Baptist is never seen as an equal or even a necessary predecessor to Jesus. And the most striking example of this realignment is the baptism itself.
Right. In Matthew and Mark, the baptism is a deeply physical initiatory moment. John the Baptist dunks Jesus in the muddy water of the Jordan River.
Which implies that Jesus is submitting to John's ministry, or at least requires some sort of earthly cleansing or anointing.
Which presents a massive theological problem for the author of the fourth gospel. Because if Jesus is the pre-existent cosmic creator of the universe, the logos that holds the stars together, how can he possibly submit to being dunked in a river by a mortal human wearing camel hair and eating locusts?
It violates the majesty of the divine word.
So how does the Gospel of John solve that problem?
By omitting the physical baptism entirely.
Wait, it's just not there.
If you read the Gospel of John, the event where John the Baptist dunks Jesus simply never happens.
That is wild.
Instead, John the Baptist merely testifies that he stood there and saw the Spirit descend on Jesus like a dove. He is strictly an observer. He is a witness to the divine reality, nothing more.
His entire purpose in the Gospel is summarized by his own quote, right? "He must increase, but I must decrease." And this intense protective curation of Jesus' majesty, ensuring he is never humbled by human systems or earthly expectations, it carries all the way through to his darkest hour, his trial and crucifixion.
Yeah, the Jesus we meet in the synoptic trial scenes is vastly different from the Jesus facing Pilate in the Gospel of John.
In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is famously stoically silent before Pontius Pilate. Pilate interrogates him, the religious leaders hurl accusations at him, and Jesus offers barely a word in his own defense.
And this silence was profoundly important to the early Christians because it tied directly back to the Hebrew prophets.
Specifically Isaiah 53, right?
Right, which describes the suffering servant. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth.
So the synoptic Jesus embraces the role of the silent victim, enduring the crushing injustice of the Roman imperial machine in order to fulfill his destiny. But the Jesus in the Gospel of John does not remain silent.
Oh, he is incredibly talkative.
Yeah. When he is brought into the praetorium to face Pilate, he doesn't just answer questions, he engages in a high-level philosophical debate.
And we have to assume, mechanically, they are speaking in Greek. Pilate, a Roman prefect, would not have spoken fluent Aramaic, and Jesus is employing concepts that belong to the Greek philosophical arena.
So Pilate is attempting to assess a political threat. He represents the raw, brutal power of the Roman Empire. His job is to eliminate anyone claiming to be a rival king. So he asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
And instead of remaining a silent, suffering servant, the Jesus of John responds by dropping a massive paradigm-shifting concept onto the floor of the Roman court.
He says, "My kingdom is not of this world."
The implications of that sentence are just staggering. It represents a total clash of worldviews.
Right, because you have Pilate, whose entire concept of truth and authority is rooted in Roman law, military force, physical geography.
And then you have the traditional Jewish expectation, rooted in the physical Torah and the hope for a restored earthly nation of Israel.
But Jesus' reality in the Gospel of John transcends both of those. It is a spiritual, cosmic reality that cannot be conquered by Roman swords.
It's so profound that it prompts Pilate to ask his famous, almost cynically modern question, what is truth?
It is the realization that they are not even participating in the same reality. But more importantly, by having Jesus debate Pilate, the author ensures that Jesus is never perceived as a helpless victim.
Exactly. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is fully, sovereignly in control of his own execution. He is not being crushed by the gears of Rome. He is a divine king temporarily allowing the Roman machine to operate.
He actually looks directly at the Roman governor and says, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above."
The supreme majesty of the Logos is protected even as he is sentenced to die.
You know, if we step back and analyze the historical fallout of that single phrase, "My kingdom is not of this world," it fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history.
It really did.
Because as long as Christianity was tied to the physical restoration of Jerusalem, it remained a localized Jewish sect. But the moment the Gospel of John shifted the kingdom from a physical territory to a transcendent spiritual reality, it became exportable.
It allowed Christianity to spread like wildfire across the Greco-Roman world, evolving into this universal Western religion.
It is the ultimate translation of a worldview, cemented right there in the dialogue with Pilate.
But the author's meticulous repair work, fixing historical timelines, elevating dialogues, protecting dignity, it does not stop with the crucifixion.
Right. The author continues this theological curation right into the tomb. Let's dive into the burial customs, because this is a perfect example of why historical context is vital for understanding these texts.
So vital.
The Synoptic Gospels present a narrative that, in the first century Jewish context, was culturally scandalous.
According to Mark and Luke, Jesus is hurriedly placed in a tomb on Friday evening because the Sabbath is about to begin at sundown. The women who follow him observe the tomb, rest on the Sabbath, and then return early Sunday morning, bringing spices to properly anoint the body.
Now, to a modern reader, that sounds like a beautiful act of devotion.
Sure.
But how would a first-century Jewish audience react to that narrative?
They would have been deeply, deeply uncomfortable.
Why?
First-century Jewish purity laws and burial customs were incredibly strict. A dead body was considered highly impure. But more importantly, there were strict gender boundaries regarding the handling of the dead. Women were permitted to wash and prepare the bodies of other women, but they were strictly prohibited from handling the dead bodies of men. Conversely, men could not prepare the bodies of women.
So the synoptic image of a group of women hiking to a tomb with the intention of unwrapping, washing, and anointing the battered, naked body of a male rabbi was a massive cultural violation.
It was highly inappropriate. It was a glaring cultural problem sitting right in the middle of the resurrection narrative.
So how does the Gospel of John handle it? It deploys a sweeping correction to fix this exact issue, right?
It does. It's almost like a software patch. In John 19, the author introduces Nicodemus, a wealthy, respected male leader of the Jewish council. Nicodemus teams up with Joseph of Arimathea on Friday afternoon before the Sabbath begins.
Okay, so they handle it.
Yes, and John specifies that Nicodemus brings a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 Roman pounds.
100 pounds of spices. That is an astronomical amount of wealth. That is the kind of burial reserved for royalty or a Roman emperor.
Which perfectly fits John's theme of Jesus as a triumphant divine king, not a criminal.
Right.
These two wealthy, respected men take the body, properly bind it in strips of linen with a massive amount of spices, completely fulfilling every requirement of Jewish burial custom. The job is done flawlessly on Friday.
Which means when Sunday morning rolls around, the cultural problem is completely neutralized.
Precisely. In the Gospel of John, the women do not bring spices to the tomb on Sunday morning. There is absolutely no need for them to anoint the body because the wealthy men already took care of it.
The cultural error of the synoptics is just overwritten and corrected.
Exactly.
It is so fascinating to watch the author methodically patch the cultural and theological holes left by the earlier texts. But, there's one final detail in John's resurrection scene that I want to push back on,
Okay, let's hear it.
because it seems to contradict the author's entire project. After all this effort to elevate Jesus to the cosmic logos, to strip away his earthly limitations, and to bury him like a god king, what happens when Mary Magdalene finally encounters the risen Jesus outside the empty tomb?
Right.
She doesn't call him logos. She doesn't fall down and call him creator.
No, she calls him Rabboni. It is an Aramaic word that translates to teacher or master.
Why leave that in? I mean, if you are the author of John and you have spent 20 chapters desperately translating this Hebrew Messiah into a Greek philosophical deity, why leave in this deeply intimate, grounded, highly Jewish moment where a woman just calls him her rabbi?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that undermine the entire word was God narrative?
I don't think it undermines it. I think it grounds it. It is one of the most beautiful tensions in the entire text.
How so?
Well, it shows us that despite the soaring Greek philosophy, despite the theological alterations of the timeline, and despite the fierce battle against the Gnostics, the historical core of the movement could not be entirely erased.
The memory was too strong.
Exactly. The deeply human, intimate memory of a Jewish teacher from Galilee who loved his followers was so thoroughly embedded in the community's DNA that it survives even in this highly Hellenized text. The Gospel of John wrestles with a dual identity: the historical Jewish rabbi Yeshua and the cosmic divine Christos. In that moment with Mary in the garden, both identities just stand side by side.
That is incredible. Let's take a breath and recap the sheer magnitude of what we've uncovered today. We started by asking why the Gospel of John feels so different from the rest of the New Testament. And what the sources have revealed is that it is not just a different camera angle on a historical event.
Far from it.
Right. It is a profoundly engineered, deeply theological masterpiece that was fought over in the 2nd century by Gnostics and Orthodox bishops. It survived manuscript alterations. It acted as a linguistic bridge, taking the Hebrew concept of the debar and transforming it into the Greek logos.
And it boldly rearranged physical history, moving the destruction of the temple and altering the day of the Passover to achieve ultimate symbolic resonance.
It demoted a major prophet, turned a silent victim into a philosophical powerhouse facing down the Roman Empire, and corrected the cultural burial errors of its predecessors.
I think the vital lesson for us today is how we approach the information we consume. When you read a text, whether it is an ancient piece of scripture, a historical biography, or even a modern article analyzing current events, you cannot simply accept the sequence of events as raw, unfiltered data.
You have to look at the architecture of the text.
Exactly. You have to ask why the author is telling you this story. Who are they arguing against? What cultural worldview are they using to translate their facts? The Gospel of John proves that an author can view the altering of literal history not as a deception, but as a necessary tool to reveal a higher, transcendent truth.
It is all about the lens of the author, which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If the ancient author of the Gospel of John felt completely morally justified in altering historical timelines, omitting major events, and rewriting the dialogue of the Roman trial to reveal what they believed was a deeper spiritual truth, how much of the historical record that we casually accept as raw, objective fact today is actually just someone else's theology in disguise?
It is the essential question of history. Never stop interrogating the text and always look for the hidden why.
Thank you for taking this intricate deep dive with us. Keep your curiosity sharp, keep questioning the narrative, and we will see you next time.